Valiant Growth episodes usually begin with a question. And the reason why I do that is because I want to engage you and I want to show you exactly what issue this episode can help you work on or solve, what need it addresses. It can get a bit formulaic though. So today I'm going to begin by reformulating these questions. So if you have conversations that seem to go nowhere, if you have intellectual debates that end with no common ground found, if you have certain personal issues where a satisfactory conclusion seems to elude your grasp, this is what this show is going to be about. Hello and welcome to Valiant Growth, the podcast that empowers you to earn self-esteem, build amazing relationships discussed today, and achieve freedom through radical personal development. I'm your host, Philip Frey, and today we will be talking about developing trust with the aim of making disagreements and conflicts not threaten the relationship or the enjoyment in the relationship. And our method will be developing shared frameworks and ideas. The reason why intellectual and emotional conflicts are unpleasant is that is their nature, but the reason why they can be persistent and they are hard to solve is usually a lack of shared trust. It feels as if talking to the other person is pointless. It feels as if finding resolution to the situation will take so much effort and success is so unlikely that it's better not addressed. And besides, the other person is probably not going to apologize. So why bother? But these resentments build up over time and they erode what could be an otherwise very enjoyable or even amazing relationship. But because this trust is lacking, trust in the intentions of the other person, trust in the capacity of the other person to handle the process of working through these issues, trust perhaps in the honesty of the other person, prevents resolution and resentment builds up. This is something that I have a lot of experience with on both sides. In contrast to the previous episode, it's a little bit late to give you a caveat, but just to be very clear, my last romantic relationship was a while ago and it wasn't successful at the time. And when I say while, I mean 5 years. And since then, I have built a framework, I've built an understanding, and I'm very confident that it would work. I'm very confident because I looked into my psychology, I tested some of the concepts in non-romantic relationships, I worked on my self-esteem. So overall, I'm pretty confident that what I'm saying is correct, but you're completely welcome to distrust me because within the context of a romantic relationship, I haven't yet tested these ideas out. The last one that I had was so disappointing and kind of disastrous that I said I need to take the time and build myself up so the next time it's a serious deal. But it hasn't happened yet, so there you go. Well, when it comes to the subject that I'm going to talk about today, here I do have experience. And I've built a very enjoyable relationship through gradually discovering these ideas and implementing them. Some of them were influenced by Free Domain Radio, others come from my therapy work, others were my own invention. And I've tested them and it worked out into a really, really good relationship and somewhat against odds because both me and the other person didn't have a lot of experience in support skills, didn't have a lot of experience in conflict resolution, didn't have a lot of experience in applied philosophy. We were never in a functional relationship. Needless to say, it also wasn't modeled to us anytime in our childhoods. So we went against significant odds, but we have succeeded. And today I have a relationship where there's a high level, a high degree of trust. And I realized this when I observed that even when we have a disagreement, and we did have and do have heated disagreements on all sorts of different subjects, I would know and he would know that whichever party was wronged could expect the other one to, after some time, after some space has been given, but not a lot of time, to come and say, okay, let's talk about this. I thought about this. Here's where I was wrong. Here's what I think the reason is, whether in the situation or in my history. And this is the commitment that I make. And usually the other party would have something to add to that as well. And even in the worst situation, and we did address some really triggering subjects. We went deep on a number of issues, and it was pretty rough at times, but always we had this certainty that the other party would come, and after some time we could reestablish it, and there was this supreme trust that this relationship is going to work, and it's going to be enjoyable again, and this person is a worthy person. And when I realized this, I was incredibly moved. It was a minor celebration because I have never experienced this in my life. And I feared that I might never experience it in the future. But there it was, and we had worked it out. And the core of it was a number of hard-won and piece-by-piece built system of shared frameworks, shared concepts, shared ideas, and shared commitments. So by the way, to comment on the structure of the show, the first bit was engaging you and helping you identify with the situation, making it relevant to you. Well, now the second part was building up credibility on my end, saying that yes, I am the kind of person who can solve this, who has some experience with this, who has some authority in the area. And it's totally genuine, but I thought it would be interesting to have a parallel discussion in this episode of how you build an engaging podcast, and the same principles, actually with principles taken from how you write good copy. And this is a new field for me, and it's just fun to experiment, and you might pay attention to that because this episode has been consciously built up like that. So I think the first step, the first common idea to develop is perhaps the meta level look at the relationship, and it could be said that it's even a worldview. So it's a big question, and the question is, what is the nature of human relationships? Are they win-lose or win-win? And you've probably heard this one. It's the concept of, are relationships a zero-sum game where somebody wins and that's balanced out by somebody else losing, or are they win-win? And an entry-level concept in economics that I've learned and that is really powerful here, it's actually considered an axiom, meaning that its truth is self-evident and requires no other proof. And that is that two parties entering into trade voluntarily are by definition gaining from the interaction. So it's not a matter of someone scamming the other person. It's not a win-lose thing. Of course, if there is no force or fraud involved. So if two people enter in a voluntary relationship with no force or fraud, both will benefit, and they're exchanging something of a subjective lower value to something of a higher subjective value. And this is key because, as I've argued before, relationships are a trade. It can be seen as a host of complex services being offered in exchange. Entertainment, emotional support, insurance. It's not a reduction of the idea of a relationship to say that they are a trade. It's simply a clarification of what they are, because they're either a trade or they are exploitation. Those are the two possibilities. And voluntary relationships are a trade. At least they're meant to be a trade. And you might say, okay, why is this important? Probably most people agree with this if you say this to them in one form or another. Well, you'd be surprised how prevalent zero-sum thinking is in the world. In business relationships and trading interactions, there are many, many people who would say that the profit that the seller makes is at the expense of the buyer. It is the seller tricking the buyer, and there's a little bit of profit that can be tolerated, and then if you go over it, then it's gouging and it's immoral. But that is not true. That is not true, because if both parties are willing to go into the exchange, the only reason why they are participating is because they're winning. The seller is willing to part with whatever he's selling because the amount of value that he gets is worth more to him than what he gives for it. And at the other end, the buyer, the item or service or whatever received is more valuable than the money, the sum that he parts with. And on a more subtle level, this is also observable in people's overall approach to relationships. They may not formulate it, but how often will you see people considering that if someone is enjoying themselves in the relationship, that is at their expense, and if they want to gain something, it can only be done at the expense of the other person? I think if you think about it, you will notice how prevalent this is in the actual actions and attitudes of people. So the fact that relationships are meant to be win-win, and that is your attitude, and that is the attitude that you wish to have in the relationship, well, if you can establish that with the other person, that will already be an excellent point of reference, and either of you can at any point say, hey, this is supposed to be a trade, this is supposed to be win-win, but in this interaction, I feel that I'm not benefiting, so let's look at it. Because you've both agreed, you can come back to that, and that is great. On to the next level, you want to be working with a shared emotional/psychological framework. That is a set of ground rules to be established, and also aims to be established. It's things such as respect is important in a relationship. And respect has a number of meanings, and two are applicable in this situation. One of them is there must be some kind of shared admiration of the other person. If that isn't there, then the relationship is kind of meaningless. But also there must be a kind of respect towards the other party, where an effort is made to not harm them, to not damage them, to not humiliate them, to not insult them, to not ignore them. These are all parts of being respectful in a relationship, and it must be established explicitly that this is something that is aimed for. Another emotional ground rule is establishing and agreeing upon the value of gentleness, that a certain kind of care and attention must be observed around sensitive subjects, around delicate subjects, around difficult questions. And also, no party is to assume, between adults, no party is to assume a parental role of domination. So a bad parental role of, this is what you have to do, this is the right way, listen to me, things like that. That is both disrespectful and usually not gentle. So gentleness is something that must be strived towards and agreed upon as a value, or discovered together as a value perhaps. And then you have empathy. And in my relationship that I was telling you about, this question was, I believe, if I remember correctly, this was the beginning of us building up these frameworks. We started talking about empathy, what it is, how it works, and what its value is. And it was initially a kind of an intellectual conversation, because this person, he knew that I'm in therapy, so he asked me, why are you in therapy? And I said, well, the thing that I opened with was empathy. I wanted to have it, but I felt that I don't. I wanted to to heal it, to grow it. And then he immediately thought of himself and he said, okay, so let me see, do I have empathy? I think I have empathy. And I said, okay, how do you define empathy? And we started the conversation there, and we really benefited from it. And now we're in a situation where we both accept and agree with the fact that empathy is extremely important in a relationship, and we strive to develop it. We strive to have it as a practice in our relationship, the practice of being empathetic as much as possible, as much as we have at the moment the capacity for, and also to develop empathy outside of the relationship and to bring ever increasing levels of empathy as a gift, as a beautiful and rich gift into the relationship. And the next thing to be discussed and a next value to be explored and agreed upon is the value of self-knowledge, the value of introspection, the value of finding out what our history really was and what we remember from it. That will be a great benefit, that will be a great aid in solving conflicts, because often in that period where both parties retreat and try to find reasons as to what has happened, try to untangle the situation, that this is where you go almost all of the time. What in my history does this event remind me of? If I had an unusual reaction, if I had an inappropriate reaction that didn't make sense in the moment, it is usually because I wasn't actually talking to the person, but I was talking to a remnant of my inner history that the situation or the way the person talked or something about it reminded me of. And the emotions, often the anger, the fury, the mockery that came out wasn't really directed to this person, but it was directed to some internal shadow from the past. And thus, it's important to identify, because it's very unfair to treat people, to punish people for things that other people have done. And to get there, self-knowledge is important, and a lot of thinking is important. And this was often, and it was such an enjoyable time. We with this person, we lived together for some time in the same house, and it was such an enjoyable process where we'd have a conversation, and usually it ended positively, but sometimes didn't. But then we'd have a break, we'd look things up, and then sometime later, it was all sometimes days, we'd come back and sit down again, and then we'd have the next long conversation going into the nights. And it would be about, look, this is what I found. This is the next piece of the puzzle. These are my new questions. And it was exciting. It was interesting. It was a beautiful experience. It was also exhausting, but it was well worth every minute. And I think back with great fondness to those times. And that is what you can have as well when you establish the value of self-knowledge and the means of cultivating it. So we had the reason for the existence of the relationship or the worldview established, which is win-win. We have established the emotional, psychological rules and interests and areas of focus. So what is left, the third important piece, is the philosophical framework that we use. And some of you will be very happy and you will say, yay, philosophy. And others will say, what, philosophy? What kind of relevance does that have? What is that about? Well, bear with me, because this will be very important and very, very impactful. And the first step towards philosophy of establishing a framework is learning and accepting the value of definition, of using clear language, and of using commonly shared and accepted definitions. So often conversations are parallel and no connection is made and no communication is established because people are using words with different definitions. So for instance, if your definition of love is as an involuntary response to your highest values, so a form of admiration, But my definition of love is, well, it's the feeling that you have that's kind of intoxicating, and it's kind of mysterious and inexplicable and wonderful, but it only has a vague connection to the object being loved. Well, we can have a conversation on the subject of love or past relationships, and we would have a very hard time, because you would say, oh, that person, you didn't actually love them, because you cannot name any quality that would elicit respect or a value that you would react to involuntarily. And I would say, no, you don't understand. I was really in love because I felt these things that are love, and you don't understand love. And hey, were you ever in love actually? Like, what are you talking about? You have no idea. And because nobody said, hey, what is love actually? There would be no communication going on. And for more on this, see episode 38 on definitions of love at valiantgrowth.com/E38. And I sometimes say /episode X. It's not episode, it's E. So in the future, if I refer to the link of some episode as episode X, it's just E, just the first letter and the number. Or another case, something that we had a problem with, or at least it was a challenge, was empathy, as I said, because turns out, what is empathy? What is the difference between empathy and sympathy? And I actually pulled up the phone and we looked at a definition, like back to school style, except this was a really fun and enjoyable and voluntary school. And it really aided our conversation, because it turned out, we're mixing sympathy together with empathy, and this is how it's defined. And we agreed upon a definition based on what we read and what we added to it. And it cleared up the conversation enormously. And I also remember hearing this on Stephen Franson's YouTube channel. This was something that worked in his relationship with his partner, that they actually sat down and they took the dictionary /smartphone/future technology that's relevant when you're listening to this, and they would check the definition of the word, and often they would find the same thing, that one of them or both of them were using the word incorrectly, and they had differing definitions, making communication very difficult. So I hope I convince you about this. It might seem strange. It might seem, what are you doing with these pulling up definitions? But if you do it with curiosity and not domineering, not like, no, you have to use the definitions, but instead introducing the idea, look, this is really cool. If we check the definition, we're going to have a so much better time discussing. Then it's something that can be done, and something very useful. And once you have language clarity, you can move on to the meaty questions of philosophy that are totally not theoretical and are very important. And I'm purposefully going to avoid terminology here when it comes to philosophy. I even regret using terminology as a complex word that will send you to sleep. I avoid it to make it more easily understandable to all of my listeners, and also because I'm not a complete expert on this, so I might mess up. So I will say people with some philosophical background will recognize the branches, but I'm not going to go into the branches here. There are two big questions that you really, really need to clarify in yourself, in the other person, and get to common ground. If you don't get to common ground on these two questions, you're gonna have a very, very hard time in any intellectual disagreement, or even any intellectual conversation. And the number one question is there an objective reality out there that we can perceive? With some error, but overall, is there a truth to be found, and are we capable as humans of finding it? That is, once again, key question. And there are many people who believe that in some form or another, we cannot really be sure about anything, and we don't know if there's a reality out there, or is it a dream, or is it the Matrix, and there's no stability and we can never know. And of course they don't behave like that in their everyday life, because they wouldn't be alive to save these words if they fully implemented this radical skepticism. But it will still swamp any conversation, because at any point you can get to, well, there's no way of knowing, and it could all be an illusion, it could all be a dream. And I don't know, maybe some of you, you've never experienced this, but I definitely have, and I definitely have had discussions ending in, well, there's no way to know, and you can't know if there's reality. I've accidentally mixed in the two. They're separate things, as you will see. And I'm sad to say, but that the past is past, that it was often me ending discussions with this, and this view that there's no objective reality or it's impossible to perceive is surprisingly common in modern philosophy. And many intelligent people who are cynical, who are kind of nihilistic, will go for this. So this must be established. And as you can probably guess, my position is, yes, there is objective reality out there. It's one reality. It's not infinite versions. There's one truth. And though we make errors, overall, we are capable of discovering it. If you don't operate from this presumption, there's kind of no point in having any intellectual conversation. And you must look into yourself and think about it and think of how you see it, and the other person must as well, and you must come to an agreement. And the reason why you must come to an agreement is because it's a necessary step for the next question, which is, if there's an objective truth out there, assuming that, how can truth be separated from falsehood? We do this all the time. We talk about, oh, this is true, this is not true, this is correct, this is incorrect, and we automatically apply methodologies for doing it. Both being rational and irrational comes naturally to humans. So we use these systems, but it's very important to talk of them clearly. And this is the value of philosophy, because once you define that, okay, these are the ground rules, this is how we approach questions of truth or falsehood, you can always, in any debate, in any discussion, in any point of contention, you can say, if you share it with the other person, you can say, okay, let's go back to our system of separating truth from falsehood, the system that we know it works and we have agreed upon using it, and let's see where we get from there. And my system is, and the system that I recommend is, reason and evidence, or logic and evidence. And this might be, again, old news for some of you, but it's important to discuss, is specifically that evidence trumps logical deductions. So this is kind of the system. If you have evidence for something, that's enough to establish truth, to separate truth from falsehood. And even if the evidence contradicts your logic or your previous understanding of how things work and combine together, you must bow before evidence. And it means that something is off with your logic and you have to find a new logic. So when there's evidence, evidence wins. When there is logic but no evidence, logic wins. And where you have both cases and they pull in opposite directions, then evidence wins and the logic must be reformulated. So I can give you an example through the question of the existence of a God. So I'm an atheist, and the intention of this episode is not to convince you either way, but just to demonstrate this system of thinking. And so the first clarification to be made is that I'm not an atheist as an identity. That is the conclusion that I've come to. And the reason why I come to this conclusion is that there is no evidence. The logic of the existence of a supernatural being contradicts all other previous knowledge that we've tested and accumulated up to this point. So in absence for evidence for God, logical inconsistencies are the arena to discuss the questions. And I personally believe that in that arena, the end conclusion is that it is inconsistent. But if there were some kind of evidence for a certain form of supernatural deity that would contradict everything that we understand about philosophy and science, and if I experience that firsthand, then when people say that they've experienced that firsthand, the logic's got to be reformed. The logic has to be changed until you once again have an internally consistent system that has incorporated this new fact, the existence of God. And of course, there are deeper questions on this subject. So for instance, things like Occam's razor, things like if the evidence is really not very solid, then it must be questioned. If it's really weak evidence and it's completely contradictory to the logic, it must be looked upon with a level of skepticism. But those are details. But fundamentally, reason and evidence is the most powerful and accurate, in my opinion, system for understanding reality and settling intellectual questions or disputes. And the more you understand it and the more the other person understands it, the more easy it will become to settle any kind of disputes, because you can always look at, okay, this is the logic, this is the evidence. To give you another example, those of you who are into economics, there's the question of the minimum wage. And I'm not going to look at the moral aspect, but the consequential question, is it good or bad as far as its effects go? And the logic of the minimum wage, if you look at from just the theoretical approach to economics, is that, should I go into this? Yeah, it's not so long. So people's salaries are based on their productivity, on their skills, on their work habits, on their level of energy, on their level of intelligence. And thus, at any given point, everybody has a certain amount of money that they can earn, a certain amount of value that they can produce given their current level of skill, etc., etc. It is profitable to employ somebody as long as what you pay them is less than the value that you get from it, and that is the profit. And the moment you are by law forced to pay them a sum where they cannot meet it in their own value production, no business can hire them without losing money. So medium term, they will be replaced with robots, or the business will be reorganized, things like that, and they will be without a job. So if you look at long-term consequences, a higher minimum wage will not increase the standard of living of the poorest and least skilled and most vulnerable workers, but instead the law will actually put them out of work. That is the logic of the minimum wage. Now, you look at the evidence and then the craziness begins, because you have a bunch of studies that reinforce this view, and they say, yeah, look, it was introduced in the state, in this isolated area, and there was a jump in unemployment. And then you have another set of studies where they say, no, look, it was introduced and there was no change. There are studies that say that it increased unemployment. And both sides of the arguments have compiled big meta-analyses of the studies that favored their perspective. So you have one side saying, we have 50 studies that shows that it has no effect. And the other side says, oh, really? We have 60 studies that show that it does. And my understanding of reason and evidence in situations such as these, where you have conflicting evidence of roughly equal value, you go by the logic. So you assume that the evidence that contradicts the logic is probably false somehow. Something is wrong in the methodology. So I would go with, in situations such as these, it still holds that the minimum wage is a bad thing. So there you go. That was another application. And if you're talking about the minimum wage, and I know some of you are absolutely talking about it, this is how you approach the question. You have this system, and then everybody brings their logic, brings their evidence, and using this system, you can easily, or not so easily, but in the end, you can if everybody agrees on the methodology, you can pretty easily find a solution. And there are layers of depth that one can go into this on the subject of reason or logic. You have a whole set of logical fallacies well worth studying. And you can really improve your conversations and get closer to the truth with more ease if both of you know and understand logical fallacies. If you study them together and mentor one another, and you observe when the other person is applying them and very gently point it out. So when it's not used as a tool of domination by one party or another, then it fails spectacularly. But when it is a shared discovery, that will improve your system. With evidence, again, there is a rich field of simply how can you become a better researcher and how can you make more sense of studies and all sorts of evidence. There is simply, as a first step, the question of source quality. What can you accept as an unbiased source? What can you reject as a biased source? Who is reliable? What form of experimentation is to be trusted? Usually there's a lot of media with making all sorts of claims, but with no sources. And then, well, at this point, I just throw them out. They're useless as a source of information. Anyone can claim anything. There are no sources. It's but a claim. And then there's the question of authority. To what extent can authority be trusted? If a doctor talks about a medical issue, what does that mean, and to what extent can that be trusted? And then you have the next level, which is, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but it is the question of experimental design, study design. What is the difference between the kinds of studies that people do? How reliable are they? If you have two studies that have reached opposite conclusions, is it possible that there's a difference of quality, and what are you supposed to look at? What is sample size and why is it important? What are the different qualities of studies, the different level of reliability that you can assign to each of them? What is the difference between an observational study versus a controlled study? What is a randomized controlled trial? What is a double-blind randomized controlled trial? I'm just throwing these out to you as keywords, and I might address them in the future episodes. But learning about all of these can add a lot of intellectual rigor and smoothness, if the both of you agree, to any kind of debate. Because you can always say, hey, we have this study, we have this other one, they contradict. We've agreed upon that we trust double-blind over observational. This one is a double-blind, problem solved. And finally, when it comes to philosophy, there is the question of intellectual honesty. And I believe that this must be talked about and kept in focus and reminded of constantly. It's very, very important to commit in a relationship and also in our own explorations of truth to stay open to new rational ideas, to not get emotionally biased towards something, or perhaps more realistically, to recognize where there is an emotional bias, to not go for winning arguments just for the sake of winning arguments, but to be able to say, oh yeah, I don't know. You made a point. I have no response. It makes sense. I'll of course have to look into it, but at this point I don't have an answer. And if you pay attention to both what you can see around you directly and the talking heads on the internet and the podcast and things like that, you will very, very rarely see such a thing. And it's so important. And so many people went down on this issue, so many highly intelligent people have gone off the deep end because they weren't committed to this enough. And I personally recommend the Anarcho-Yactilist podcast, Nick Hazelton's podcast, for some examples on how he handles questions, and it was really eye-opening and inspirational to me. You can find him at an-yak.com, and I've also done 2 interviews with him. So yeah, these are the frameworks to think of, and even though we're already into many minutes, I could only touch upon them because this is a work of months and years to learn and develop and reach agreement on questions such as these. But I guarantee it to you that this will really alter your relationships to the better. It will make them amazing with the people whom you can implement this with, which won't be everyone, or might not even be most people, but the people whom you can implement this with, it's going to be really nice. And when you have this, trust will spring up, and it will be beautiful. So once again, it is number 1, worldview, reason for the existence of the relationship, the role of the partners in it, which is trade and win-win. Second, emotional framework, the questions of respect, the questions of gentleness, the questions of empathy. And number 3, philosophy, which is intellectual honesty, the value of having clear language and of using definitions, and metaphysics and epistemology. Oh no! The questions, is there objective reality out there? And how can truth be separated from falsehood? Reason and evidence, how do they work? The scientific method. All of these are very important, and I hope I've convinced you, because if I began with, oh yeah, you gotta study the scientific method to have great relationships, probably wouldn't have made sense to people who are discovering philosophy for the first time, but I hope that it makes sense. So let's look at objections. You might say, Philip, this is really uncool. I want to have relationships that are organic. This is too cold, agreeing on this stuff. I can't even envision how it will work out. I want to have more natural relationships. And my answer to that is, number 1, I've presented these ideas very intellectually within the context of this podcast, because that's how you present them. But in practice, you can very much adapt them to how you want your relationships to be, and who you are and who the other person is, and what your views are. So it doesn't have to be, okay, I re-listened to this episode from this guy on personal development and on the relationships, dear John, and here's a list of questions that we must agree upon, and here's the photocopy, and here's the PowerPoint presentations, and please tick where you agree and mark it with an X where you disagree, and we shall formally discuss it. It doesn't have to be like this. It's really up to you how you approach it. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you will say, yeah, that's pretty cool. Let's go with the list. There will be people like that. There will be people who might want to weave it into their conversations and to approach it very differently. But here's the thing. There are 3 questions in every relationship that have an answer whether you answer them or not. Whether you define them or not, these things will play out somehow. And these 3 questions are: what is the basis for the relationship between the parties? What is the reason for the existence of this relationship? That's number 1. Number 2, how is emotional conflict resolved? Number 3, how is intellectual conflict resolved? And if you don't answer them consciously, then they will come from patterns from your history, patterns from the history of the other person, how people around you handle it right now. And the issue is that usually doesn't work. hence why relationships are usually not very enjoyable or have to be very shallow to be enjoyable. So let's look at these questions again. What is the relationship of the parties? What is the reason for the existence of the relationship? What are the dynamics? Well, most commonly, it's win-lose, as I've said previously, and it's not surprising because most parents apply a win-lose approach to their relationship with their children. If you bother me, I'm going to be sad. The only way I can be happy is that if you leave me alone. Or if I comply with the desires of you, dear child, that is a sacrifice for me and I'm doing it grudgingly and you'll repay me at one point. And this is the model that we get. The model that we get is that whoever is more powerful in the relationship imposes their will and wins and the other person loses. This is the default for most of the world, both in childhood and then from that in adulthood. It's unavoidable. And when the son or daughter grows up and they're bigger and they're smarter, suddenly it switches around. And then in adult to adult relationships, sometimes one person tortures the other for their benefit and other times the other does. And you might say, oh, that's a pretty dark view. And it's not actual torture, but it's always, okay, so I want to go camping and you want to go to the beach and somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. And if I lose, no problem. And the fairness in the relationship comes from the fact that I will avenge myself one way or another when I have the chance. This, it's pretty sad, and this the default position for many relationships. Win-win is bandied around in management training seminars, but it's rarely observed without a philosophical background. Next, how is emotional conflict resolved? There are many ways, and many of them are unhealthy. One of the most common one is the virtue of forgiveness. So forgiveness is an important thing, and the person who was wronged, it's actually his or her responsibility to grow up and get over it and be the adult, be the grown up, and forgive and forget. And I call this emotional conflict resolution, but it's more like emotional conflict postponement / bomb creation, because what happens is that the resentment builds up, it blows up, it gets extremely nasty, then makeup situation occurs and there's a lot of love in the air, but there's never any resolution, there's never any discussion, there are never really any commonly agreed ground rules. Everybody has their own rules and they try to impose it on the other person, and this is how emotional conflict is resolved. Or another approach is that if someone is wronged, then they're justified in inflicting even greater punishment the next time around. And these are terrible systems, but they're the ones that are most commonly used, and if people don't define them, there's a good probability that this is where they'll end up. And how is intellectual conflict resolved? Where, again, there are variations here, but one of the most common one is, do your views fit into mainstream views, the views of our group? If yes, then that's great, and if not, we will ridicule / ostracize / assault you until you come back to the fold. Or alternatively, there's the path of rebellion, where are your views the exact opposite in every single situation of the mainstream views? If not, you will be ridiculed, ostracized, assaulted until you get back into the fold. End of story for intellectual conflict resolution. Or the most intelligent person will use their intellect not to prove the situation, not to prove the argument, not to demonstrate and come to an agreement, but they use it to dominate the other person. Or it can be the most physically powerful, the most intimidating, and fundamentally there is no intellectual resolution. That's why you see people massively entrenched on certain sides of an argument and they never move, and it's been going on for hundreds of years and there's no resolution, and most people either follow what their parents thought about this issue or radically oppose it, and that's it. So if you don't seek answers to these questions, and I gave you what answers I've found, if you don't seek answers to these questions, they will answer themselves, and that answer will be history/environment, and usually you don't want to go with that. You don't want to go with that. And if your history and your environment has been very healthy, it will still benefit you to understand the roots of it. It will make it easier for you to stick to them and to be assertive when someone is not playing according to these functional rules. So that's my answering of objections. Now, the call to action. How do you adapt this thing? How do you adapt these frameworks? Because I mean, it's all great that we're talking about these things, but how do you go to someone and say, okay, we gotta develop these things? Like that's pretty strange. That's pretty unusual for most people. Well, step number one, and this is a little bit misleading because I don't have all the steps, but step number one is you have to model it. This has been a huge learning opportunity for me, that I had some of these views before, but I wasn't living according to them, and I tried to convince/badger other people into them, and I wasn't convincing at all, and it didn't work. And then I adapted them and I built them in myself to some extent. And then when I said, okay, for example, intellectual honesty is a value, and they could see that I am committed to that as well, then it worked. So first, do everything to adapt it yourself and to live it within the relationship. So perhaps even before you get to these ideas to, hey, look, what I was thinking about this, even before that, start implementing these. Start becoming more empathetic, showing more support, showing more respect, showing more philosophical consistency on your end. Model it. I think the next step is express the idea in some form or through your actions that you take relationships seriously. So not just this relationship, but overall, your view is that relationships are something that are very important and something that must be studied to be done really well. So you must communicate the fact that I think there's a way to improve relationships. I am studying this question right now, and I want to improve my relationships. And if the person is not on board with this, it's not going to work. And you have to establish this first, so that then when you say, okay, these are the ideas, they don't look at you like, well, you're insane, but it will make sense. Yeah, working on relationships. And then I say, at least my path was, and this might vary with you, and it might fork. This might be a fork in the road, but at least the way this approach worked for me is that we began with kind of intellectual discussions. I engaged the curiosity of the person, of my friend, and I said, hey, what do you think about empathy? Or look, I'm using definitions and it's really cool, and this is the reason why I'm doing it. Or look, there are these philosophical questions, what do you think? And engage their intellectual curiosity, and from that you can move on to also, I'd like to implement this, and what do you think? And this is where we could learn, and things like that. Now, a big advice is don't be dominating. Even if you're more advanced on a certain subject, one of the subjects that I've talked about, if you try to impose this on the other person, that's not going to work. A good example is logical fallacies. If your way of introducing high-level logical consistency into your relationships is by pointing out the other person's every logical mistake, it's not going to work. If you value this person, if you've decided that you want to be in a relationship with them, you must trust them enough to the point where you don't have to force this onto them, quote unquote, force this onto them. You don't have to dominate them and correct them, but it's enough for you to say, hey, look, these are the ideas that I have, and this is my realistic and honest assessment of where I am. You can't say that you're an expert unless you are. But look, I looked into this and it's interesting and it seems useful, and if you're interested, we can talk about it. And if we implement this, I think it would be cool. But you have an out if you wish to have it. And from there, experiment. And I'm curious how this goes. And I hope that you remember, because this is again a time intensive process. It's gonna take you some time, but I hope that you will remember if you heard these ideas here for the first time, or even if you were encouraged to implement some of these things. I would love to hear how it works out for you, and I hope you remember to send some feedback, because I might be wrong, and I'd like to see do these ideas work, and was my presentation of them effective enough to make them actionable in your life, and B, what variations people experience. Because I have one approach, but you'll have something else, and you have a different personality, and there are all sorts of beautiful variations that stem from one single idea, one single framework. Thank you for listening to Valiant Growth, and I dare you to flourish today, but please don't go. Let's talk about contacting me. We were on the subject. So the best way to contact me is to come to the Valiant community, which is a Facebook group. Just search Facebook, or alternatively visit valiantgrowth.com/community. Also, you can send me an email if you want more privacy to valiantgrowth@gmail.com. I have received a number of emails already, and it's been very fun to hear about what you think. Some people wrote me about what they do. Some people wrote me about how they listen to Valiant Growth, and it's really cool, and it helps me understand your needs better. Please, if you've enjoyed today's episode, go to iTunes, subscribe, and leave a rating. That's what other podcasters tell me that I have to do. No, it helps increase the reach of the show. And the best way to listen to the podcast, I haven't mentioned this in some time, is to get the app. There's a special Valiant Growth app for your listening pleasure, and it's out on Android and it's out on iOS. So just search the App Store / Play Store, and you will find it, and you can download it, and it has all sorts of cool features, and it's great. I also have a question to you. So we're already talking about communication here. I'm thinking about the kind of episodes that I release. So as you probably noticed, I'm focusing on mostly solo shows, which is I build up a script, develop an idea, and then I present it to you, ranging anywhere from 15 to 60 minutes. But I also do book reviews, I also do interviews, and I could also do a kind of co-host approach where I talk to someone, and there are trade-offs for all of these, and there are benefits for all of these. Well, that's one part of a trade-off. So please leave me some feedback. Would you like to have more interviews? Did you enjoy the ones I've had so far? Would you like me to give you more? Would you like more book reviews? Are you running out of good books to read? Or are you interested in what I'm interested in? Would you like me to experiment with some kind of occasional co-hosting situation where we sacrifice a bit of the depth, but we add more points of view and more liveliness to it? I'd love to have your feedback, and please come to valiantgrowth.com/community and tell me what you think, and hopefully start a conversation. Also, if you come to the community, or if you're already part of a group, there's an introduction section, and I'd really like to find out a little bit more about you, and even those of you who are my friends already, well, for the other members, they they might be interested in who you are. And also feel free to share good resources there. I'd like to have really valuable and engaged place there where you can really use it as your hub for personal development. And I would like to encourage you to engage people and bring ideas and start discussions. And I have to do it too. So we're both going to work on it. Again, thank you for listening and have a nice day.